Hello again and welcome back. Occult history, the initiates of ancient times, and their understanding, and what was the mindset of ancient times. 23rd degree Chief of the Tabernacle. The inhabitants of India originally practiced the patriarchal religion. Even their later worship of Vishnu was cheerful and social, accompanied with the festive song, the sprightly dance, and the resounding cymbal, with libations of milk and honey, garlands, and perfumes from aromatic woods and gums. Perhaps the mysteries commenced, and in them, under allegories, were taught the primitive truths. We cannot, within the limits of this lecture, detail the ceremonies of initiation, and shall use general language, except where something from those old mysteries still remains in masonry. The initiate was invested with a cord of 3 threads, so twined as to make 3 times 3, and called senna. Hence comes our cable tow. It was an emblem of their true deity, the remembrance of whom we also preserve in the 3 chief officers of our lodges, presiding in the 3 quarters of that universe which our lodges represent, in our 3 greater and 3 lesser lights, our 3 movable and 3 immovable jewels, and the 3 pillars that support our lodges. The Indian mysteries were celebrated in subterranean caverns and grottos hewn in the solid rock, and the initiates adored the deity, symbolized by the solar fire. The candidate, long wandering in darkness, truly wanted light, and the worship taught him was the worship of God, the source of light. The vast temple of Elephanta, perhaps the oldest in the world, hewn out of the rock, and 135 feet square, was used for initiations, as were the still vaster caverns of Salsette, with their 300 apartments. The periods of initiation were regulated by the increase and decrease of the moon. The mysteries were divided into 4 steps or degrees. The candidate might receive the first at 8 years of age, when he was invested with the zenna. Each degree dispensed something of perfection. Let the wretched man, says the Hitopadesa, practice virtue. Whenever he enjoys one of the 3 or 4 religious degrees, let him be even-minded with all created things, and that disposition will be the source of virtue. After various ceremonies, chiefly relating to the unity and trinity of the Godhead, the candidate was clothed in a linen garment without a seam, and remained under the care of a Brahmin, until he was 20 years of age, constantly studying and practicing the most rigid virtue. Then he underwent the severest probation for the 2nd degree, in which he was sanctified by the sign of the cross, which, pointing to the 4 quarters of the compass, was honored as a striking symbol of the universe by many nations of antiquity, and was imitated by the Indiana in the shape of their temples. Then he was admitted to the holy cavern, blazing with light, where, in costly robes, sat in the east, west and south, the 3 chief hierophants, representing the Indian true deity. The ceremonies commenced with an anthem to the great God of nature, and then followed this apostrophe: O mighty being, one greater than Brahma, we bow down before thee as the primal creator, eternal God of God, the world's mansion. Thou art the incorruptible being, distinct from all things transient. Thou art before all gods, the ancient absolute existence, and the supreme supporter of the universe. Thou art the supreme mansion, and by thee, O infinite form, the universe was spread abroad. The candidate, thus taught the first great primitive truth, was called upon to make a formal declaration, that he would be tractable and obedient to his superiors, that he would keep his body pure, govern his tongue, and observe a passive obedience in receiving the doctrines and traditions of the order, and the firmest secrecy in maintaining inviolable its hidden and abstruse mysteries. Then he was sprinkled with water, whence our baptism. Certain words, now unknown, were whispered in his ear, and he was divested of his shoes, and made to go 3 times around the cavern. Hence our 3 circuits. Hence we were neither barefoot nor shodden. The words were the passwords of that Indian degree. In Egypt he instituted hieroglyphics. He selected a certain number of persons whom he judged fittest to be the depositaries of his secrets, of such only as were capable of attaining the throne and the first offices in the mysteries. He united them in a body, created them priests of the living God, instructed them in the sciences and arts, and explained to them the symbols by which they were veiled. Egypt, 1,500 years before the time of Moses, revered in the mysteries one supreme God, called there only UN created. Under him paid homage to 7 principal deities. It is to Hermes, who lived at that period, that we must attribute the concealment or veiling relation of the Indian worship, which Moses unveiled or revealed, changing nothing of the laws of Hermes, except the plurality of his mystic gods. The Egyptian priests related that Hermes, dying, said, "Hitherto I have lived an exile from my true country, now I return thither. Do not weep for me. I return to that celestial country whither each goes in his turn. There is God. This life is but a death." This is precisely the greed of the old Buddhists, or Saimanians, who believed that from time to time God sent Buddhas on earth, to reform men, to wean them from their vices, and lead them back into the paths of virtue. Among the sciences taught by Hermes, there were secrets which he communicated to the initiates, only upon disposition that they should bind themselves, by a terrible oath, never to divulge them, except to those who, after long trial, should be found worthy to succeed them. The kings even prohibited the revelation of them, on pain of death. This secret was styled the sacerdotal art, and included alchemy, astrology, magism, magic, the science of spirits. He gave them the key to the hieroglyphics of all these secret sciences, which were regarded as sacred, and kept concealed in the most secret places of the temple. The great secrecy observed by the initiated priests, for many years, and the lofty sciences which they professed, caused them to be honored and respected throughout all Egypt, which was regarded by other nations as the college, the sanctuary, of the sciences and arts. The mystery which surrounded them strongly excited curiosity. Orpheus metamorphosed himself, so to say, into an Egyptian. He was initiated into theology and physics, and so completely made the ideas and reasonings of his teachers his own, that his hymns rather bespeak an Egyptian priest than a Grecian poet, and he was the first who carried into Greece the Egyptian fables. Cicero says that the initiates not only received lessons which made life more agreeable, but drew from the ceremonies happy hopes for the moment of death. Socrates pays that those who are so fortunate as to be admitted to the mysteries possessed, when dying, the most glorious hopes for eternity. Aristides says that they not only procure initiates consolations in the present life, and means of deliverance from the great weight of their evils, but also the precious advantage of passing after death to a happier state. Isis was the goddess of Say, and the famous Feast of Lights was celebrated there in her honor. There were celebrated the mysteries, in which were represented the death and subsequent restoration to life of the god Osiris, in a secret ceremony and scenic representation of his sufferings, called the Mysteries of Night. The kings of Egypt often exercised the functions of the priesthood, and they were initiated into the sacred science as soon as they attained the throne. So at Athens, the first magistrate, or archon-king, superintended the mysteries. This was an image of the union that existed between the priesthood and royalty in those early times when legislators and kings sought in religion a potent political instrument. Herodotus says, speaking of the reasons why animals were deified in Egypt, "If I were to explain these reasons, I should be led to the disclosure of those holy matters, which I particularly wish to avoid, and which, but from necessity, I should not have discussed at all." So he says, the Egyptians have at Say, the tomb of a certain personage, whom I do not think myself permitted to specify. It is behind the temple of Minerva. The latter, so called by the Greeks, was really Isis, whose was the often cited, enigmatical inscription, "I am what was, and is to come, no mortal hath yet unveiled me." So again he says, upon this lake are represented by night, the accidents, which happened to him, whom I dare not name. To that end he was taught that his soul was immortal, and that error, sin and vice must needs, by an inflexible law, produce their consequences. The rude representation of physical torture in Tartarus was but an image of the certain, unavoidable, eternal consequences that flow by the law of God's enactment from the sin committed and the vice indulged in. The poets and mystagogues labored to propagate these doctrines of the soul's immortality and the certain punishment of sin and vice, and to accredit them with the people, by teaching them, the former in their poems, and the latter in the sanctuaries, and they clothed them with the charms, the one of poetry, and the other of spectacles and magic illusions. They painted, aided by all the resources of art, the virtuous man's happy life after death, and the horrors of the frightful prisons destined to punish the vicious. In the shades of the sanctuaries, these delights and horrors were exhibited as spectacles, and the initiates witnessed religious dramas, under the name of initiation and mysteries. Curiosity was excited by secrecy, by the difficulty experienced in obtaining admission, and by the tests to be undergone. The candidate was amused by the variety of the scenery, the pomp of the decorations, the appliances of machinery. Respect was inspired by the gravity and dignity of the actors and the majesty of the ceremonial, and fear and hope, sadness and delight, were in turns excited. The hierophants, men of intellect, and well understanding the disposition of the people and the art of controlling them, used every appliance to attain that object, and give importance and impressiveness to their ceremonies. As they covered those ceremonies with a veil of secrecy, so they preferred that night should cover them with its wings. Obscurity adds to impressiveness, and assists illusion, and they used it to produce an effect upon the astonished initiate. The ceremonies were conducted in caverns dimly lighted. Thick groves were planted around the temples, to produce that gloom that impresses the mind with a religious awe. The very word mystery, according to Demetrius Phalereus, was a metaphorical expression that denoted the secret awe which darkness and gloom inspired. The night was almost always the time fixed for their celebration, and they were ordinarily termed nocturnal ceremonies. Initiations into the mysteries of Samothrace took place at night. It did those of Isis, of which Apuleius speaks. Euripides makes Bacchus say that his mysteries were celebrated at night, because there is in night something august and imposing. Nothing excites men's curiosity so much as mysteries, concealing things which they desire to know, and nothing so much increases curiosity as obstacles that interpose to prevent them from indulging in the gratification of their desires. Of this the legislators and hierophants took advantage, to attract the people to their sanctuaries, and to induce the night to seek to obtain lessons from which they would perhaps have turned away with indifference, if they had been pressed upon them. In this spirit of mystery they professed to imitate the deity, who hides himself from our senses, and conceals from us the springs by which he moves the universe. They admitted that they concealed the highest truths under the veil of allegory, the more to excite the curiosity of men, and to urge them to investigation. The secrecy in which they buried their mysteries, had that end. Those to whom they were confided, bound themselves, by the most fearful oaths, never to reveal them. They were not allowed even to speak of these important secrets with any others than the initiated, and the penalty of death was denounced against anyone indiscreet enough to reveal them, or found in the temple without being an initiate, and anyone who bad betrayed those secrets, was avoided by all, as communicated. The Egyptians call them their mysteries. Concerning these, at the same time that I confess myself sufficiently informed, I feel myself compelled to be silent. Of the ceremonies also in honor of seers, I not venture to speak, further than the obligations of religion will allow me. It is easy to see what was the great object of initiation and the mysteries, whose first and greatest fruit was, as all the ancients testify, to civilize savage hordes, to soften their ferocious manners, to introduce among them social intercourse, and lead them into a way of life more worthy of men. Cicero considers the establishment of the Eleusinian mysteries to be the greatest of all the benefits conferred by Athens on other commonwealths, their effects having been, he says, to civilize men, soften their savage and ferocious manners, and teach them the true principles of morals, which initiate man into the only kind of life worthy of him. The same philosophic orator, in a passage where he apostatizes Ceres and Proserpina, says that mankind owes these goddesses the first elements of moral life, as well as the first means of sustenance of physical life, knowledge of the laws, regulation of morals, and those examples of civilization which have improved the manners of men and cities. Bacchus, in Euripides, says to Penthcus that his new institution, the Dionysiac Mysteries, deserved to be known, and that one of its great advantages was that it prescribed all impurity, that those were the mysteries of wisdom, of which it would be imprudent to speak to persons not initiated, that they were established among the barbarians, who in that showed greater wisdom than the Greeks, who had not yet received them. This double object, political and religious, one teaching our duty to men, and the other, what we owe to the gods, or rather, respect for the gods calculated to maintain that which we owe the laws, is found in that well-known verse of Virgil, borrowed by him from the ceremonies of initiation: teach me to respect justice and the gods. This great lesson, which the Hierophant impressed on the initiates, after they had witnessed a representation of the infernal regions, the poet places after his description of the different punishments suffered by the wicked in Tartarus, and immediately after the description of that of Sisyphus. Pausanias, likewise, at the close of the representation of the punishments of Sisyphus and the daughters of Danaus, in the temple at Delphi, makes this reflection that the crime or impiety which in them had chiefly merited this punishment was the contempt which they had shown for the mysteries of Eleusis. From this reflection of Pausanias, who was an initiate, it is easy to see that the priests of Eleusis, who taught the dogma of punishment in Tartarus, included among the great crimes deserving these punishments, contempt for and disregard of the holy mysteries, whose object was to lead men to piety, and thereby to respect for justice and the laws, chief object of their institution, if not the only one, and to which the needs and interest of religion itself were subordinate, since the latter was but a means to lead more surely to the former, for the whole force of religious opinions being in the hands of the legislators to be wielded, they were sure of being better obeyed. The mysteries were not merely simple illustration and the observation of some arbitrary formulas and ceremonies, nor a means of reminding men of the ancient condition of the race prior to civilization, but they led men to piety by instruction in morals and as to a future life, which at a very early day, if not originally, formed the chief portion of the ceremonial. Symbols were needed in the ceremonies, which referred to agriculture, as masonry has preserved the ear of wheat in a symbol and in one of her words, but their principal reference was to astronomical phenomena. Much was no doubt said as to the condition of brutality and degradation in which man was sunk before the institution of the mysteries, but the allusion was rather metaphysical, to the ignorance of the uninitiated, than to the wild life of the earliest men. The great object of the mysteries of Isis, and in general of all the mysteries, was a great and truly politic one. It was to ameliorate our race, to perfect its manners and morals, and to restrain society by stronger bonds than those that human laws impose. They were the invention of that ancient science and wisdom which exhausted all its resources to make legislation perfect, and of that philosophy which has ever sought to secure the happiness of man, by purifying his soul from the passions which can trouble it, and as a necessary consequence introduce social disorder. And that they were the work of genius is evident from their employment of all the sciences, a profound knowledge of the human heart, and the means of subduing it. It is a still greater mistake to imagine that they were the inventions of charlatanism, and means of deception. They may, in the lapse of time, have degenerated into imposture and schools of false ideas, but they were not so at the beginning, or else the wisest and best men of antiquity have uttered the most willful falsehoods. In process of time, the very allegories of the mysteries themselves, Tartarus, and its punishments, Minos, and the other judges of the dead, came to be misunderstood, and to be false because they were so, while at first they were true, because they were recognized as merely the arbitrary forms in which truths were enveloped. The grand periods for initiation into the Druidical mysteries were quarterly, at the equinoxes and solstices. In the remote times when they originated, these were the times corresponding with the 13th of February, 13th of May, 19th of August, and 1st of November. The time of annual celebration was May Eve, and the ceremonial preparations commenced at midnight, on the 29th of April, when the initiations were over. On May Eve, fires were kindled on all the kens and cromlechs in the island, which burned all night to introduce the sports of May Day. The festival was in honor of the sun. The initiations were performed at midnight, and there were 3 degrees. The Gothic mysteries were carried northward from the east, by Odin, who, being a great warrior, modeled and varied them to suit his purposes and the genius of his people. He placed over their celebration 12 hierophants, who were alike priests, counselor of state, and judges, from whose decision there was no appeal. He held the numbers 3 and 9 in peculiar veneration, and was probably himself the Indian Buddha. Every thrice 3 months, thrice 3 victims were sacrificed to the true God. The Goths had 3 great festivals, the most magnificent of which commenced at the winter solstice, and was celebrated in honor of Thor, the prince of the power of the air, that being the longest night in the year, and the one after which the sun comes northward, it was commemorative of the creation, and they termed it Mother Night, as the one in which the creation of the world and light from the primitive darkness took place. This was the Yule, or Yule, feast, which afterwards became Christmas. At this feast the initiations were celebrated. Thor was the sun, the Egyptian Osiris, and Neph, the Phoenician Bel, or Baal. All persons were initiated into the lesser mysteries, but few attained the greater, in which the true spirit of them, and most of their secret doctrines were hidden. The veil of secrecy was impenetrable, sealed by oaths and penalties the most tremendous and appalling. It was by initiation only that a knowledge of the hieroglyphics could be obtained, with which the walls, columns and ceilings of the temples were decorated, and which, believed to have been communicated to the priests by revelation from the celestial deities, the youth of all ranks were laudably ambitious of deciphering. The ceremonies were performed at dead of night, generally in apartments underground, but sometimes in the center of a vast pyramid, with every appliance that could alarm and excite the candidate. Innumerable ceremonies, wild and romantic, dreadful and appalling, had by degrees been added to the few expressive symbols of primitive observance, under which there were instances in which the terrified aspirant actually expired with fear. The pyramids were probably used for the purposes of initiation, as were caverns, pagodas and labyrinths, for the ceremonies required many apartments and cells, long passages and wells. In Egypt a principal place for the mysteries was the island of Philae, on the Nile, where a magnificent temple of Osiris stood, and his relics were said to be preserved. With their natural proclivities, the priesthood, that select and exclusive class, in Egypt, India, Phoenicia, Judea, and Greece, as well as in Britain, and Rome, and wherever else the mysteries were known, made use of them to build wider and higher the fabric of their own power. The purity of no religion continues long. Rank and dignities succeed to the primitive simplicity. Unprincipled, vain, insolent, corrupt and venal men put on God's livery to serve the devil. With all and luxury, vice, intolerance and pride depose frugality, virtue, gentleness and humility, and change the altar where they should be servants, to a throne on which they reign. Initiations were celebrated. Thor was the sun, the Egyptian Osiris, and Neph, the Phoenician Bel, or Baal. The initiations were had in huge intricate caverns, terminating, as all the Mithriac caverns did, in a spacious vault, where the candidate was brought to light. Joseph was undoubtedly initiated. After he had interpreted Pharaoh's dream, that monarch made him his prime minister, led him tried in his second chariot, while they proclaimed before him, Anescu, and set him over the land of Egypt. In addition to this, the king gave him a new name, Safnath-Painch, and married him to Asnath, daughter of Putiphera, a priest of On Hierapolis, where was the temple of Atum-Re, the great god of Egypt, thus completely naturalizing him. He could not have contracted this marriage, nor have exercised that high dignity, without being first initiated in the mysteries. When his brethren came to Egypt the second time, the Egyptians of his court could not eat with them, as that would have been abomination, though they ate with Joseph, who was therefore regarded not as a foreigner but as one of themselves. And when he sent and brought his brethren back, and charged them with taking his cup, he said, Know ye not that a man like me practices divination? Thus assuming the Egyptian of high rank initiated into the mysteries, and as such conversant with the occult sciences, so also must Moses have been initiated, for he was not only brought up in the court of the king, as the adopted son of the king's daughter, until he was 40 years of age, but he was instructed in all the learning of the Egyptians, and married afterwards the daughter of Jethro, a priest of On. Likewise, Strabo and Diodorus, both assert that he was himself a priest of Heliopolis. Before he went into the desert there were intimate relations between him and the priesthood, and he had successfully commanded, Josephus informs us, an army sent by the king against the Ethiopians. Simplicius asserts that Moses received from the Egyptians, in the mysteries, the doctrines which he taught to the Hebrews, and Clement of Alexandria and Philo say that he was a theologian and prophet, and interpreter of the sacred laws. Mantho, cited by Josephus, says he was a priest of Heliopolis, and that his true and original, Egyptian, name was Asasaph, or Osasif, and in the institution of the Hebrew priesthood, in the powers and privileges, as well as the immunities, and sanctity which he conferred upon them, he closely imitated the Egyptian institutions, making public the worship of that deity whom the Egyptian initiates worshipped in private, and strenuously endeavoring to keep the people from relapsing into their old mixture of Chaldaic and Egyptian superstition and idol worship, as they were ever ready and inclined to do, even Aaron, upon their first clamorous discontent, restoring the worship of Apis, as an image of which Egyptian god he made the golden calf. The Egyptian priests taught in their great mysteries, that there was one God, supreme and unapproachable, who had conceited the universe by his intelligence, before he created it by his power and will. They were no materialists nor pantheists, but taught that matter was not eternal or coexistent with the great first cause, but created by him. The early Christians, taught by the founder of their religion, but in greater perfection, those primitive truths that from the Egyptians had passed to the Jews, and been preserved among the latter by the Assyrians, receive also the institution of the mysteries, adopting as their object the building of the symbolic temple, preserving the old scriptures of the Jews as their sacred book and as the fundamental law, which furnished the new veil of initiation with the Hebraic words and formulas, which, corrupted and disfigured by time and ignorance, appear in many of our degrees. Such, my brother, is the doctrine of the first degree of the mysteries, or that of chief of the tabernacle, to which you have now been admitted, and the moral lesson of which is devotion to the service of God, and disinterested zeal and constant endeavor for the welfare of men. You have here received only hints of the true objects and purposes of the mysteries. Hereafter, if you are permitted to advance, you will arrive at a more complete understanding of them and of the sublime doctrines which they teach. Be content, therefore, with that which you have seen and heard, and await patiently the advent of the greater light,